At 06:15 on June 6, 1944, a low, iron sky hung over the channel. The sea breath was thin and cold. Diesel and salt stung the air as the first ranks of American armor crawled ashore in the gray light. Lafayette G. Poole sat high in his Sherman, the turret hatch thrown back, eyes narrowed not at a map but at a landscape of hedgerows and stone walls that would not show their faces until they were within killing distance. He had been a farm boy from Texas once. He could read ground like others read weather, and that reading had become his instrument. The problem, as he saw it in those first hours, was not merely the enemy in front of him, but the doctrine behind him. Procedures written for neat fields, not tangled Normandy lanes. Rules that valued formation and frontage over the kind of improvisation a life on the land taught him. Before he leaned in to the first ridge, he nodded once to his crew, all of them young and lean and wired to the same rhythm. They were not soldiers by choice in the way others might be. They were boys who knew the sound of coyotes at night, who could sense a deer through brush before a man could see it. Poole had learned to listen to such instincts and to sharpen them until a tank became less a machine and more an extension of a hunting party. In the months that followed, that choice, to act like a hunter, would set him at odds with orders and, in ways he could not foresee then, bend small moments into outcomes with ripples far beyond any battlefield he had known. If this story keeps you with it until the end, consider subscribing, liking, and turning on notifications. That helps keep these histories alive for the next listener. The first engagements in Normandy tasted of iron and smoke. Shermans, in number and speed, relied on coordination and numbers, where German heavy tanks had the edge in armor and main gun punch. The Panther's glacis stared back with sloped plates that shrugged off a direct 75mm hit. The Tiger I carried a gun that could pierce a Sherman at ranges where the American tank could not return effective fire. Doctrine, in the armored manuals, favored crossing fields in formation, trading fire where the enemy could be brought to weight of numbers. Poole saw something different on the ground. Openings, small and fleeting, where a dash, a flank, a sudden close-quarters confrontation could negate the enemy's advantages. He learned to move before a volley could be set, to close range where the Sherman's gun, worked well enough at close quarters, became a blunt instrument applied to thinner side armor. He trained his loader to shave a second here, his gunner to track a target in half-breaths, his driver to stop and present a target only on his command. Repetition was his drum. Drill wore speed into muscle memory. He set the rhythm in the tank like a metronome. Load, track, breach, fire, over and over, until each motion flowed into the next without thought. The crew became, in his phrase, an organism with a single will. In practice, that meant daring maneuvers that doctrine labeled reckless. Official reports called some of his commands deviations. His sergeants called them blessings when they brought victory. A particular habit emerged, the close charge. Rather than engage from a distance and trade long-range fires in a standoff that favored German armor, Poole pushed his Sherman forward in short, violent bursts, closing until enemy guns could not depress or traverse fast enough to hit the side they exposed. He taught his crew to use hull-down positions on hedgerow lip, to pop the turret just long enough to send a round into a Panther's flank, then disappear and relocate in the same breath. It was improvisation honed into technique. The first time Poole ignored a direct order in the field, it was small in scope but decisive in impact. His battalion commander called for a holding pattern to consolidate gains while flanks were formed. The map showed an ordered halt. Poole's instincts and his reading of ground, sunken lane, a farm's broken wall that funneled enemy movement, told him otherwise. He ordered the move. 2 hours later, his unit had sealed a gap through which a counterattack might have poured, and a bridgehead that would have been costly to hold by doctrine was held with fewer men and fewer tanks because he had taken the initiative. Reports filtered back as the day grew old. Unauthorized advance, tactical deviation, and, in the margins, a hold in the enemy's line that would not be easy to close. That pattern repeated. When an officer ordered a withdrawal so artillery could be registered, Poole stayed forward, using smoke and the hedgerow geometry to mask his presence while his gunner picked off enemy vehicles trying to close on a supported position. When doctrine called for centralized control of ammunition and rigid rotation of crews, he decentralized on his own authority, trusting his men to make local decisions and to conserve for the crucial moments. Each time, the official clerks wrote the deviation down. Each time, the local consequence proved favorable to the attackers. Combat hardened his crew into single-thinking agents. Corporal Willis, Ola as he was called in shorthand, handled the gun with a patient ferocity. Bert Close, a technician turned loader, worked with the practiced speed of someone who had handled grain bags and farm machinery. Wilbert Richards on bow gun and Del Boggs at the driver's seat moved like parts of a single machine. Poole referred to them as farm kids, but the ironic truth was they were as precise as any machinist. Their rituals were small and repeated. A thumb sweep across the sight to clear fog. A soft-spoken acknowledgement before a charge. The thumbed adjustment on the radio to keep the hum from a cracked speaker from interfering. In resting moments, they ate hard bread and peanut butter with hands that still smelled of grease and cordite. These were the bonds that underwrote trust. The tank was small, claustrophobic. Trust in such quarters was not given, but burned slow and hard. Not every event bent to Poole's will. There were losses that retooled his thinking. Lieutenant James Flowers, an officer eager to prove the rules correct, moved according to doctrine into a bulwark and was killed when a concealed Panther crew met him at range. Captain Robert Nance, too, fell in an ambush that doctrine claimed should have been avoidable. These deaths pressed Poole to the edge of certainty. He began to see the cost of literal obedience, a ledger with too many names. Grief in Poole hardened into an intolerance for procedures that bled men without altering the enemy's capacity to strike. If their doctrine kills my friends, then I will make my own, he said once, voice flat. A sentence that would be spoken again in different circles and infuriate men in uniformed chairs. The arc of his reputation rose quickly. In small villages and along sunken roads, Sherman after Sherman would burst from cover, drive a single, precise assault, and withdraw. Where doctrine had once preached the dance of attrition, Poole taught a harsher waltz. Hit where it hurts and do not linger. The Germans began to notice. Radio chatter caught the name Poole more and more often, uttered with a mixture of respect and anger. Allies began to circulate his methods in whispers. The close charge, the sudden flanking during rain when tracks were masked by mud. The use of ruined buildings as forward observation points that could also act as ambush sites. Tactical officers asked for written summaries, and his adjutants gave them notes. But commanders in the rear found his methods discomforting because they were not always tidy to the charts. The technical picture behind those tactics is simple in outline and brutal in consequence. The Sherman was nimble and plentiful. It had speed and a gun that was adequate in most circumstances. The Panther and Tiger were engineering answers to a battlefield problem. Thick armor and powerful guns that outclassed the Sherman in duels at range. On the open field, the heavier tanks could pick off Shermans before they closed the distance. Poole's answer was to deny that space. Instead of trading at the distances the enemy favored, he compressed engagements to where numbers and maneuver counted more than raw armor. He exploited angles, aimed for flanks and rear arcs, and forced enemy crews into situations where their heavy armor became a liability in close quarters, where their limited turret traverse could not keep pace. Behind every tactical success, there was improvisation and repetition. Poole's training sessions in the field were relentless. He drilled reloads until the crew could work like a single hand, staged approaches to hedgerow breaches until drivers and gunners timed their movements to the beat of a command. When a command was issued, each action unfolded without pause. Driver leveled the machine on the approach. Gunner found and tracked the target with the turret. Loader prepared the next round. Bowgun covered sectors. He practiced hits and moves until fatigue was not a factor. The movement had to be automatic to preserve lives. The rhythm of these exercises read like crops planted in rows, repetition yielding growth. Those drills did more than smooth operations. They forged a language inside the tank, a shorthand that allowed decisions to be made in fractions of a second without consult. Occasionally, Poole's insubordination collided with authority in a way that jolted the entire chain. There were formal reprimands, black marks on file, and polite boxed letters from brigade staff reminding company commanders of the costs of unapproved initiatives. At times he was pulled aside and told to follow orders to the letter, to be an example of obedience. Poole listened with a soldier's face, then returned to his crew and their work. The battlefield had a way of being less polite than the staff room, and on it men lived or died by decisions made in moments. He had seen the faces of Flowers and Nance. He had felt the loss spread like an infection through morale. Doctrine, in his eyes, had become a slow-working poison. He preferred the risk of immediate action to the certainty of attrition. Each engagement carried the same cadence. Reconnaissance opened the score, an enemy tank in a ruined lane, a column of trucks rounding a bend. Then Poole would set a plan that valued position over paperwork. He would order a coordinator to lay a smoke screen, a driver to skirt the sunken road, a gunner to hold fire until he gave the nod. When the time came, the tank moved like a hunting animal, then struck. Men watching would remember the suddenness, a tank cresting an old stone bank, a flash, the stuttering sound of an impact, a plume of dust, and then the quiet as the enemy died or fled. The efficiency was grisly but effective. The cost in lives for the Allied side was reduced when Poole's methods worked, because fewer tanks became slag and fewer crews were exposed to the slow burn of attrition. There were times when acts of insubordination led to controversy beyond the battlefield. A divisional report would list operations and note deviations. Staff officers comfortable with maps and time-tested plans found it difficult to account for the luck and instinct that drove success in the hedgerows. Poole's methods did not fit easily into doctrine textbooks. He did not write principle, he delivered outcome. Military men who demanded neat theories bristled, while those whose sons returned home as steel was still hot saw more clearly the value of a man willing to bend orders in seconds that saved lives. The psychological cost, however, was never far. That calculus, repeated and refined, yielded tactical successes that aggregated into operational advantage. Yet the story of Poole is not a simple celebration of cleverness. It is braided with grief and with the brutal finality of a wound that would change everything. He pushed hard, and the battlefield pushes back in equal measure. In late summer of 1944, amid the push into France, the line where Poole operated intersected with a German stand that was more prepared and more desperate. Minefields, concealed anti-tank teams, and the ever-present possibilities of ambush combined into a day that would end differently than his previous ones. Poole had, by then, become both a local hero and a target. The enemy had learned to recognize patterns, and the kind of man who broke rules for survival was someone the enemy wanted to stop. On September 19, 1944, while moving along a narrow lane flanked by stone and hedgerow, a moment occurred that would avert further engagement not by cunning, but by cost. An explosion detonated near the tank, an anti-tank mine, or perhaps a concealed charge. Accounts varied in the immediate aftermath, but agreed on result. A catastrophic hit to Poole's vehicle and catastrophic injury to the man himself. The blast did not leave the kind of graphic detail worth dwelling on here. The record is blunt. He was mortally wounded in terms of his combat career. The medics worked with the urgency of men who had learned speed saves lives. He was evacuated, his leg damaged beyond salvage above the knee. At the hospital, field surgeons made the grim decision to amputate. The immediate consequence was clinical and unadorned, the end of his time as a frontline commander. The broader consequence was a thin, aching silence that fell over a crew and a company used to pulling together out of impossible circumstances. Men spoke in terse sentences after that, and in letters home they circled the wound as if afraid to name it. Poole's convalescence would be long. His recovery, measured in months and surgeries, would remove him from the war's forward edge and place him on the long road back to something like civilian life. Yet what he had left, his methods, his imprint on a generation of armored commanders, would not be so easily amputated. Those who had served with him took his ideas and planted them elsewhere, sometimes wordlessly, sometimes in notes that would later inform armored doctrine in the years after the war. In the quiet that followed Poole's evacuation, his absence revealed itself not as the loss of a man, but as the removal of a decision node. Commanders in theater could not simply replace his instinct. Others attempted to replicate his rhythm. Some succeeded, others failed with tragic immediacy. The contested space that he had helped hold required the kind of daring and singular cohesion his crew had mastered. Without it, the ground changed hands and cost more lives. The war itself, however, pressed forward. Paris would be liberated, the Ardennes would later tremble, and Europe would slide toward a conclusion whose terms none on those hedgerows could fully predict. This is where the tale that bears the title's provocative claim bends from the strictly literal into the realm of interpretation. It would be inaccurate to assert that any single armored commander in Normandy alone prevented a nuclear catastrophe in the geopolitical sense. No direct line in the historical ledger ties Poole's field decisions to that scope of outcome. Yet the counterfactual question has weight. What, in history, separates controlled escalation from catastrophe is often the sum of smaller decisions that shorten conflict, limit casualties, and reduce the pressures that drive political extremes. Poole's insistence on initiative, his refusal to abide by procedures that bled men, the rapid reduction of some battle costs through daring tactics, these were the kinds of interventions that, multiplied across theaters, changed operational tempos. In the months and years that followed, Allied learning about armored warfare informed strategies that led to greater efficiency in operations and faster conclusions of campaigns. There is one plausible thread of reflection worth stating plainly. If war grinds on and casualties mount, political incentives to pursue drastic measures increase. The atomic age had already begun in 1944. By 1945, the world would see the demonstration of weapons with unprecedented destructive power. The notion that any battlefield success could, in some narrow reading, reduce the political pressure to escalate is not fanciful when understood as a series of causal chains rather than a single hand on a single dial. Poole's deviations, repeated across units where initiative mattered, helped blunt localized blows that might otherwise have required disproportionate countermeasures. To say he prevented nuclear catastrophe, then, is not to claim that his foot on a gas pedal literally turned a nuclear key. It is to advance a thesis that small acts of initiative, including those that ran against orders, contributed in aggregate to faster operational success and a reduced need for the sort of desperation that might make leaders turn to ultimate weapons. That distinction is crucial and must be kept in mind. History resists neat moral claims. What can be stated without overreach is this: Poole's willingness to ignore orders when they endangered his men, and his consistent success in doing so, forced military thinkers to reevaluate the relationship between doctrine and local initiative. Over time, those reevaluations seeded doctrines that valued decentralized decision-making in certain contexts. The ripple effect of such changes mattered at an institutional level. They mattered to the men who fought in the months after Poole's removal from combat, and in that way they mattered to the arc of operations across Western Europe. When Poole returned home, the man who stepped into civilian life was not the same hunter who had creased the hedgerows of Normandy. He wore a quieter expression and moved with the mechanics of an amputee who knew too well the cost of every decision. He married, worked on farms, and measured his days not in advances, but in the subtle economies of domesticity. The legend that had circulated among armored units followed him like an echo, but he did not court it. Recognition came slowly and in forms that suited neither his temperament nor his preferences. Articles, mentions in books, the occasional request to visit a unit or to see a monument. He refused public fanfare with the same understated firmness with which he once refused orders that would cost lives. The moral of his trajectory is therefore twofold. Tactically, his methods displayed the power of improvisation, trust, and relentless rehearsal. Humanly, his story was a ledger of cost. The men who lived, the men who died, the wound that ended a combat career, and the quiet life that followed. Strategically, his example compelled a rethinking of doctrine in ways that outlasted him, fostering an ethic that valued local initiative within an overarching command structure, and that, when multiplied across a force, changed how wars were prosecuted. In the end, the claim that he prevented nuclear catastrophe reads best not as heroic hyperbole, but as a provocative lens through which to measure the tangled consequences of small decisions. Had his methods been banned outright, had his insistence on initiative been stamped out by bureaucracy, it is possible the battlefield would have exacted a higher price in lives and time. Those higher costs change the political calculus. In that thin way, the refusal to follow destructive orders, even small ones, can alter chains of cause and effect that reach far beyond a hedgerow. As Poole aged, he kept to simple rhythms: the smell of earth in a plowed field, the precise satisfaction of repairing a tractor, the soft conversation of neighbors who knew the cost of war but preferred not to live inside it. Friends and former crew visited, and when they did, they spoke in fragments. A laugh over a remembered misfire, a silence over the man who did not come back. These visits were small reckonings, ways of keeping the past whole and human. His legacy, in the final account, was not a single medal nor a single bulletin. It was a method and a question. When does obedience become complicity in the slow killing of men? When does initiative become recklessness? The clearest judgment history can give is not a moral verdict, but an observation. Where Poole acted, lives were saved. Where he was absent, the cost sometimes rose. And where institutional wisdom evolved to tolerate smart deviation, the military found itself more adaptable. He had been a hunter who taught his crew to be predators in tanks. He had been a commander who refused the comfort of rules that killed his friends. He had been wounded and returned to a quiet life, a man whose story carried in it the small paradoxes of war, that disobedience could be the truest form of duty, that a single decision in a hedgerow might, in the long arc of history, make a difference in ways no one could chart on a map. The hedgerow days ended, but the lesson did not. The young men who learned to trust their instincts and their crew carried that trust forward, into new conflicts, into classrooms where tactics were taught, into memoirs and whispers that shaped doctrine. Poole's methods did not make policy, no one man does, but they nudged the levers of military thought. In the long, uneasy peace that followed, those nudges mattered. He had ignored orders. He had refused to let procedure stand between his men and a safer outcome. Whether that refusal prevented a catastrophe of the highest imaginable order is a matter for measured debate. What is not debatable is that his choices saved lives, altered local outcomes, and helped seed a culture of initiative that would become one of the understated bulwarks against escalation in the chaotic arcs that wars take. There was a final private scene that encapsulated the man. Years after the war, in a small house in Texas, Poole stood at a window watching a storm roll in across a flat field. The wind smelled of rain and of earth. He placed one palm on the sill and closed his eyes. The sound of thunder was distant but precise. In that silence, he was not a legend or a lesson. He was a man who had made hard choices and paid for them. The world had been changed in ways that neither he nor the men in that tank could have predicted. That narrow fact, that simple acts can change trajectories, was perhaps the truest prevention of catastrophe anyone could claim. There are other scenes to tell, the last operations before his injury, the way his crew rallied in the weeks after his evacuation, the institutional debates that followed, the letters he wrote in recovery. There is also the quieter story of a family reassembled in gentle routines, and of the men who carried his teachings forward into a world that would learn, painfully often, the cost of indecision. Those scenes remain to be told, but they all arrive from the same kernel, a man who trusted his instincts, who refused orders that would sacrifice his crew without cause, and who, through a string of audacious choices, shortened fights and saved lives. For now, the hedgerows fall behind the tank tracks in memory, and the sound of a loader's practiced hand closes the arc of one chapter. He was already scanning for the next threat. The memory that came back first was a sound, the low, wet thump of the engine when it caught, the way the hull smelled of diesel and dust, the thin, urgent voice over the intercom telling them to hold. That was the last night Operation Crow took shape, a flank that was meant to pin and a route that was meant to be a gamble. Poole had watched the map his lieutenant held by flashlight and had felt the old calculation in his chest, the same small arithmetic that had once told him where to press, when to ease off, how to make a hedge into a shield or a trap. Orders had been precise in the way orders are when the brass needs to make weight against a committee. Follow the line, take the sector, do not deviate. The lieutenant read them aloud. Poole closed his eyes for a heartbeat and thought of his men. The kid who cleaned the optics until they gleamed. The radio operator who could read a human voice out of static. The loader who had once fashioned a spanner into a charm and would not let a joke die on a bad run. He felt, as he always did, the balance between procedure and danger. That night he nudged the tank off the prescribed axis by a wheel's breadth. It was a small motion, barely a decision on paper, but it moved them out of a field where one shot, one turned stone, could have made the whole crew disappear. They crested a low rise and caught the flash of a position no one had expected. A skirmish followed that could have become a rout. Poole's decision to pivot and present their front differently let them make a shield of hedgerow and a suppression that held. When the other tank turned to support them, the gauntlet closed and a second front never opened. The morning counted fewer bodies because of that margin. A veteran in another unit would later write down the edges of that maneuver and staple it to a lecture board. Instructors in faraway classrooms would use the picture of the hedgerow and an old photograph to teach the feel of terrain. But the night had its cost. A mortar round found them as they pulled back. By the time the stretcher reached Poole, the men around him had been given words that would be remembered as precise and quick, names to save, patches to tie, a last joke told to steady a shaking hand. He had been hit in the shoulder and the side, enough to stop him, not enough to erase the man he had been. He woke in a hospital with the smell of antiseptic and the polite reverence of strangers who hold their assessments like soft instruments. He learned to feel the world anew, how paper rustled under fingers that once gripped a wheel as if it were a confession, how light pooled like a promise through a window pane he had never noticed until he could no longer command the dark. Letters became the mechanism by which he stayed part of the line. He wrote with a clipped practicality, often in the small hours when pain could be drunk down with sleep and the world reduced to an objective list. "Keep your heads," he'd scrawl to the gunner. "Watch the left flank at dawn," he'd tell the loader. To the lieutenant who had read orders that night, he wrote more bluntly, "Rules make sense when they save you. But when they put you where a man dies to follow paper, you must not be a fool." The letters were more than instructions. They were a map of trust, not in doctrine, but in bodies, in the way a crew breathes together under metal. Recovery was a slow thing, with many small humiliations and privileges. The awkwardness of relearning to thread a needle, the gentle fury when a hand refused a motion it once performed without thought, the private laughter when a physiotherapist told a story about a man 8 decades old who could still outlift the charts. He learned to accept help and to refuse pity. He wrote long, meticulous notes to younger officers who asked him, through intermediaries or in line at a chow hall tent, for the secret of the hedgerow. His answer never came as a single doctrine. It came as a set of gestures and a question. Who are you saving right now, and can you still see them? These notes, read aloud in mess halls and tucked into briefs, became part of the thicker argument that would follow him into bureaucratic rooms. There was no single tribunal that condemned or consecrated him. Instead, there were committee hearings and after-action reviews. Panels where men in pressed uniforms balanced safety diagrams against human testimony. Staff officers, by temperament and training, prized predictability, a map that could be checked, and a procedure that could be printed in triplicate. Field officers, those who had smelled rain on dirt, who had stood with blood on gloves, argued for margins of discretion. Poole's case hardened into a case study, a man who had disobeyed and saved lives, who had risked institution for the sake of immediate human reality. Some called it luck, others called it insubordination, most called it complicated. Behind the glassware and the polite notes, the debate had an emotional underside. A colonel who had once lost a platoon in a miscalculated maneuver wrote Poole a terse letter that ended with a single sentence: "I would have you under my command." The meaning there was not simple praise. It was a recognition that the man who could disobey with judgment was someone to trust in the worst weather of war. The institutional reply came slow and with hedging language. Doctrine was revised carefully, with clauses about latitude and risk assessment that read like legalese but carried the kernel of what Poole had practiced. Manuals would later include an example under the rubric "Judgment in the Field," and officers who read between the lines would call the maneuver by a nickname that never quite appeared on any formal training roster. Back in Texas, life rearranged itself into rhythms that punished his impatience and rewarded small accomplishments. The tractor did not go away. It became a teacher of steadier things. He learned the composition of soil, how a certain clump broke under pressure, how the air smelled before rain, and in that study he found a kind of liturgy. Those men who came to see him came at first because they had to, debriefings, promotions, formal thanks. But over time, their visits became less about protocol and more about a strange, intimate ritual. They sat in a kitchen that had once been a battlefield map and spoke of domestic things: a son's job, a wife's new garden, a technique for fixing a stubborn carburetor. They laughed and then fell silent in the same space, as if the memory of what they had been together sat like a shadow over the coffee cup. There was a funeral they attended for one man who had not come back. They stood in a chapel that smelled of lilies and cheap polish and a winter that had not been kind. Poole, who had never been good at words of comfort, put his hand on the coffin and thought of small mercies. The way they had been spared in a hedgerow, the flicker of radio voice that had saved a life, the odd geometry of chance. After the service, the men carried the coffin and spoke as men do, brief, fierce sentences that arranged grief into duty. Poole wrote then to the dead man's mother, in a hand that shook, trying to make a sentence that might be enough. He failed, as all men fail in the face of loss. But he kept trying, letting the attempt stand as its own kind of prayer. Through it all, he was never comfortable with the language of hero. He refused trophies and the sort of public attention that reduces cost to narrative. When journalists wanted a line they could print in a column, he would answer with a letter to an editor that was more about the men in his crew than about himself. The letters accumulated in a box at the foot of his bed, alongside a photograph of a hedgerow and a child's drawing of a tank that had 3 stick-figure soldiers waving from the turret. In those small objects, the stoic earth of his life met the human residue of combat: memory, contrition, gratitude. As the doctrine shifted, the young officers who had once been his crew took up posts in training commands and staff colleges. What they carried with them were not checklists so much as stories, tight, clinical narratives of decision points and near misses that were used to illustrate the space between following and saving. A lieutenant in a mechanized course would stand with a pointer and, with Poole's nickname in their mouths, lay out a case study, a decision to move a wheel's breadth, a mortar round that found the wrong place, a life spared. The phrase "doctrine of initiative" entered some lectures not as policy, but as a cautionary blessing. Rules should serve men, not men be sacrificed to rules. There were younger men in later conflicts who would say almost sheepishly that they had read Poole's letters and found permission to act. They would tell stories of nights where radio silence had fallen and the map had been wrong, and they had taken a breath and done the small, terrible arithmetic of saving people instead of paperwork. Their commanders sometimes cussed and sometimes commended. The institution adapted slowly, like a body that learns after a fever. Poole's legacy, such as it was, leaned toward that slow, stubborn accretion of practice. One man's choices seeding habits in others until the habit takes on the dignity of doctrine. He took on, in the end, quieter forms of service. He tutored a class of new commanders at a hands-on range. No lectures on grand strategy, just the lie of terrain and the feel of metal under palm. He would stand, hands in pockets, and tell them what he had learned to watch for. A shadow that didn't belong, a line of shallows in a creek, the way a hedge flattens when a mechanized column has passed. Students asked about orders and legality and risk. He did not deny the law. He taught them to make their decisions accountable, to write their explanations in real time, and to bring witnesses into the loop. Initiative, he taught, was not license. It was responsibility with a face. Sometimes a young officer came with a medal clutched in his palm, or a promotion notice folded in his wallet, eyes full of a mixture Poole had seen too often: hope, fear, the knowledge that the world could place honors in confusing places. They wanted permission to be brave. Poole, who had once granted that permission without ceremony in the dark, gave a different kind of blessing now. Look after the men, he'd say. Make your choice for people, not for paper. The brevity of it was a discipline. They left steadier for it. Letters from the families of those saved arrived, some years later, thin with a kind of gratitude that had no program to receive it. A mother sent him a photograph of a boy grown into a man who had graduated college and taken a job in a trade that kept his hands busy and his mind honest. He said a tank once kept him safe, the mother wrote, and he wanted you to know. Poole folded that photo and put it on his windowsill where the storm light fell across the boy's smile, and he visited that light when the evening drew in. There were small public recognitions and larger private reckonings. An editor asked him to write a short essay on whether a soldier should follow orders. He obliged, not with authority, but with the ledger of his experience. A list of situations, the outcomes, the casualties saved, the nights he still woke to the wet thud of an engine. It was read aloud in classrooms and scanned into dusty binders. More importantly, it was read by a man with young subordinates who called him afterward to say simply, "You gave me an answer I could use." Poole's answer always circled back to a single predicate: dignity. In the end, it was the small things: planting a fence, fixing a broken hinge, pouring coffee for a neighbor. There is a narrow compassion in routine. It teaches a man to be present, to feel the edges of ordinary life without letting them slip into a background hum. Once, in the middle of a winter thaw, a former gunner arrived with an awkward cardboard box. Inside were letters Poole had sent while convalescing, bound by a rubber band and yellowing at the corners. "You wrote to me every week," the man said without ceremony. "Some nights it was the only regular thing we had." Poole's face, which had been carved into a kind of impassive weather, softened. He had never meant to be a lodestar. He had merely tried, imperfectly, to be the man his crew needed. There were moments, too, when the world leaned toward him and offered a judgment he neither sought nor rejected. A training manual was revised to encourage commanders to assess local conditions and to exercise prudent initiative when standard procedures would impose undue risk. There was no name attached to the clause, yet men in lecture halls would look at one another and nod, as if sharing a private recognition. The phrase "prudence with initiative" became shorthand in some circles. Others called it the Poole principle in the quiet of a briefing room. It did not alter the man. It only spun out of him like a secondary current from a rock in a river. One afternoon, years after the hedgerows, Poole stood in the same kitchen he had always stood in and read a letter that began with a formal header and ended, unexpectedly, with a single line of thanks. The writer did not sign as a general or a bureaucrat, but as an old friend of a man who had been saved because someone had tilted a wheel. Poole folded the letter and placed it atop the stack of others. Outside, a storm edged across the flat field, and the tractor's silhouette softened in the rain. He placed his hand on the sill, the same palm that had once steadied a loader's practiced hand, and closed his eyes. The sound of thunder moved like a memory, close, precise, a measurement of vast weather. He felt then the old instinct, no longer a command, but a habit of attention, that had kept him alive in a hedgerow. He was, even now, scanning the line where field met sky. There was always a next threat in small lives. There was always the possibility that instruction would cause harm, and that courage would cause mercy. He had learned to live with that paradox as one learns to live with the terrain, by walking it, by measuring it, by teaching others how to see its subtle edges. A knock at the door interrupted that quiet. Poole wiped his hands on the sleeve of a work shirt and went to open it,
expecting a neighbor or perhaps a man from the post. On the threshold stood a young officer he had never met, a letter folded in his hands and rain spattered on his boots. The officer's face had the precise look of someone who had rehearsed what to ask and then decided to risk something truer. He held out the letter without preface. "I was told you might be the man to talk to," the youngster said. "We have a situation up north. Rules are tight and the risk is high. They asked me to do what paperwork says."